Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well. Today I wanted to do something a little different and rank all of the main locations in Baldur's Gate 3 from worst to best. And I want to make this clear from the very start, I don't think any of the locations in Baldur's Gate 3 are bad. In fact, I think that every place in this game is excellent in its own way, which honestly made ranking them all quite difficult. Like pretty much all of my ranking videos, this ranking isn't exactly based on any sort of objective measure of quality, but it's how these locations resonated with me personally. And again, as always, I'd love to hear all of your own lists down below. Just quickly, if you enjoy this type of content, please consider subbing to the channel and dropping a like. And without further ado, let's get right into it. Okay, starting with the bottom of this list, we have Rivington. And that's of course not because I think Rivington is weak, but it's because of what it represents. To me, it's simply a threshold into the real city of Baldur's Gate, and it's designed to slow you down before the city truly opens up, and in that sense, it does exactly what it's supposed to. When you first arrive in Act 3, Rivington feels lived in, tense, and overcrowded with people who've been displaced by the same danger that's been following you since the Nautilus. Refugees line its streets, guards argue with the common folk, and there's this constant feeling that Baldur's Gate is right there, but just out of your reach. Although Rivington isn't exactly massive compared to the larger portion of the city, there's actually a surprising amount happening here. Its quest range, although varying in quality greatly, still gives you quite a lot to do. From the open-hand temple's murder investigation to the circus of the last days, both of these perfectly mix the sort of variety you've come to expect from the side quests in this game. But even Rivington's smaller interactions, like navigating the tensions between the refugees and the Flaming Fist guards, reinforce the idea that this city is one that is already boiling under pressure before you've even reached its heart. Yet in spite of all of that, Rivington is not a place I felt that I could actually settle in. It's just a space that you pass through and not one that is supposed to actually be lived in. Most of the quests in Rivington simply funnel you forward into the lower city or exist primarily to set up certain themes and conflicts that will be explored much later. The area itself is relatively compact, and once you've finished up the very few key story beats in the area, there's not really any other reason to linger about. To me, compared to other regions in the game, Rivington doesn't evolve alongside you, but it remains static while the story simply moves on. That sense of impermanence is definitely intentional. I think it's the reason why I find it difficult to rank Rivington much higher on this list. It's just there to do transitional work, as it introduces Act 3's political tensions, its moral ambiguity, and the human cost of it all. But to me, it doesn't ever deliver on those ideas in a way that feels complete on its own. And to be clear, I don't think that's an issue when you look at it in isolation. Rivington does succeed at what it's trying to be. It's supposed to be atmospheric, grounded, and simply there to lay the path forward towards the actual city. But when it came to ranking all of the game's major locations, I didn't find Rivington as memorable or fulfilling to exist in, and to me it falls behind in terms of exploration, narrative payoff, and just how magical it feels. It's a necessary stop on our journey, but the game makes it all too clear that it's definitely not the destination. Moonrise Towers is easily one of the most narratively important locations in all of Baldur's Gate 3, yet at the same time, I find it to be one of the most restrictive locations in the entire game. For most of Act 2, Moonrise Towers will loom in the distance as a symbol of absolute control. You'll hear about Ketheric Thorm long before you meet him, and Moonrise itself is very much framed as the heart of the Shadow-Cursed lands, being the source of both fear and authority. By the time you finally do approach it, you've already built an expectation that this will be a place you'll truly sink into. But what I find interesting about Moonrise is how it intentionally subverts that expectation. If you decide to pretend to be an avid follower of the Absolute, the place won't be immediately hostile, and instead it'll function as a place to be infiltrated. You'll be allowed to walk freely inside its halls, speak to the cultists of the Absolute, and observe how Ketheric's power over this region actually plays out. Seeing vendors casually selling their wares beneath banners of the Absolute, or guards casually enforcing cruelty on the unlucky goblins who made their way in, gives Moonrise Towers this chilling sense of normalcy. In what you'd expect to immediately be the most chaotic location in the game thus far, is instead an area full of order and presence, and I think that's what makes it so unsettling. But to me, that sense of intrigue doesn't last as long as it feels like it should. Like the rest of the Shadow-Cursed lands, Moonrise Towers is a relatively compact location, and once you've spoken to its key NPCs, freed the prisoners, and explored its interior spaces, it quickly begins to feel like you've seen everything it has to offer. The towers don't meaningfully change at all while you're there, and most of its narrative weight, I find, is tied to events that happened before or after your time inside of it. And I think this is most obvious during the actual assault on the towers. While the battles themselves are undeniably epic in scale, the structure of the encounters are fairly rigid and linear. Even the initial confrontation with Ketheric atop the tower, while easily one of the most important moments in the game's story, feels more like a checkpoint than the culmination of a place that you've truly inhabited. The reveal of the Mind Flayer colony underneath Moonrise Towers definitely reinforces this feeling, and whilst thematically effective, it shifts focus away from the towers themselves, making Moonrise just feel like a surface level facade rather than a fully realized space. By the end of Act 2, Moonrise feels less like a location you remember for what it actually offered, and more like a symbol that you simply need to dismantle on the way to something deeper. And that's why it ultimately ranks this low for me. Of course, I really can't understate how essential it is to the story, and how perfect it is as a narrative anchor for Act 2, but for me, as a place to actually explore, to live in, it never quite opens up enough. The Underdark is a location that leaves a strong impression the first time you see it, largely because it's just so different from everything you've seen up to that point. Reaching it at all to me already carries a sense of discovery, whether it's through the Whispering Depths, the Zentrum hideout, or the numerous other hidden entrances scattered throughout Act 1's wilderness. The moment you arrive, the game makes it clear that this isn't just an extension of the world above. The lighting completely shifts, the sound design becomes much more intentional, and the environment itself feels innately hostile in a way that the world above just doesn't. I think what the Underdark does exceptionally well, and in many ways better than almost all of the locations in the entire game, is atmosphere. The muted flora lights your path forward, massive chasms will spew out creatures beneath your feet, and every new area you accidentally stumble upon feels like it's hiding danger just out of sight. Even within the Underdark itself, its own subset of mini locations, from the Selûnite outpost to the Myconid colony, all have distinct identities, each filled with its own quest and treasure to find. You're constantly moving between ancient ruins, living settlements, and industrial spaces carved into the rocks itself, which all gives the Underdark this massive sense of scale and variety that not many other regions in this game can match. But at the same time, this is where I find that the Underdark begins to show some of its limitations. While I can easily say that each area is definitely memorable on its own, the region as a whole feels quite fractured. Instead of functioning as a single cohesive space, the Underdark often feels like a collection of loosely connected set pieces. You move from one pocket to another, with relatively little narrative or environmental continuity tying them all together beyond their shared location beneath the surface. Again, I don't think this is inherently a flaw, but it does affect how the area feels to explore and live in over time. I find that on replays especially, that sense of disconnectedness gives way to a more mechanical experience. Navigation can feel disjointed, and progression through the area begins to be more about ticking off boxes rather than getting lost in the space itself. To me, even the few interesting story bits you do find in the Underdark, like dealing with Nier or interacting with the Myconids, feel self-contained, rather than part of some sort of broader Underdark narrative. Yet none of its issues ever take away from how incredible the Underdark actually is. It's one of Baldur's Gate 3's most visually distinctive regions, and the source of some of the strongest moments in Act 1. But again, when I personally compare it to later locations that evolve alongside you or encourage a sense of long-term immersion, the Underdark feels more like a sequence of unforgettable encounters instead of a world you actually settle into. I don't think anyone can deny that the Underdark is spectacular and memorable, but for me it just never quite comes together as cohesively as the regions ranked above it. Right bang in the middle of our list is the Shadow Curse lands, and I think I can say without a doubt that it is the most tonally committed region in the entire game. The Shadow Curse itself dominates everything in sight, with light barely holding on and every step forward feeling like it's being taken under pressure. Unlike the locations before and after it, the Shadow Curse lands aren't just dangerous, but they're oppressive by their very design. What I think really defines this area though is just how tightly its environment is tied to its story. The curse isn't some sort of abstract background flavor, but it actively shapes how you move through the world. Without protection, the land itself will begin to consume you, which forces you to rely on light sources and blessings in order to progress safely. That sort of mechanical pressure, especially in the first couple hours of Act 2, reinforced the narrative idea that this is a land frozen in decay and is sustained only by fragile pockets of resistance. Without a doubt, the emotional anchor of the region is the Last Light Inn. It's one of the few places in the game where safety feels temporary rather than guaranteed, with it always feeling like the Absolute's forces could envelope it any second. The presence of refugees, harpers, and characters like Isabel are great in grounding the region in true human cost, making the curse feel personal rather than something distant. And when the safety of this region is threatened, such as when Marcus attempts to kidnap Isabel from within, the consequences are immediate and severe, reinforcing just how brittle hope is in this part of the world. Even beyond places like the Last Light Inn and Moonrise Towers, the Shadow-Cursed Lands also houses some of the game's most thematically dense content, particularly through the Gauntlet of Shar. Rather than feeling like a disconnected dungeon, the Gauntlet itself functions as a larger philosophical extension of the region itself. Its trials reflect Shar's ideals of loss and obedience, and they of course directly intersect with Shadowheart's personal quest in a beautiful way. The Gauntlet isn't just a test of your combat or puzzle-solving skills, but it's a space where belief systems are interrogated through environment and choice. Despite all of these strengths, the main problem I have with the Shadow-Cursed Lands is that they are intentionally restrictive. As you're all aware, the region is more linear than most, and exploration is often guided by necessity rather than curiosity like in Act 1. Of course, that focus works incredibly well for the story, but it does limit how freely you can exist in this space. You're just constantly moving towards the next objective, rather than lingering for the sake of discovery. And that to me is ultimately why this region sits in the middle of my ranking. The Shadow-Cursed Lands are fantastic at conveying mood and thematic weight, and it tells a powerful story of grief through its design. But it's not a place where you wander through freely or return to fondly. It's simply a crucible, one that is memorable and emotionally heavy, but is defined by its linearity rather than freedom. The very first region you wander around in Baldur's Gate 3 is of course the wilderness of Act 1, and for many of us it's the place where we found the true magic of this game. You're dropped into a beautiful and sprawling landscape with no clear directive beyond simple survival, and almost immediately the game begins rewarding your curiosity. The paths within this region branch off naturally, and even the smallest detour off them can spiral into something absolutely incredible. To me, what makes the Act 1 wilderness so effective though is its density. Areas like the Emerald Grove, the Blighted Village, and Auntie Ethel's wetlands all exist within close proximity of one another, yet they all feel distinct in tone and purpose. The Emerald Grove is where you're introduced to the game's moral complexity, as you're forced to navigate between the Tiefling refugees and the Druids without the option for any clean solution. Then there's the Goblin Camp, which offers a completely different dynamic, where anything from infiltration, deception, or just outright carnage are all equally viable options. None of these spaces feel inherently isolated, but they all feed into each other, creating a region that feels alive and reactive. And I think this is where Baldur's Gate 3's commitment to player agency is most immediately felt, even more so than any other location in the entire game. Every decision you make here ripples forward in visible ways, whether that's the fate of the Tieflings or how certain companions begin to perceive you. Most importantly, the game never pressures you to move on quickly while you're in this region. You're actually encouraged to explore at your own pace, to experiment with dialogue options and approach situations creatively, whether that's through combat or persuasion or something else altogether. The wilderness itself of course supports this level of freedom. Verticality plays a major role here, with cliffs, hidden tunnels, and vantage points constantly inviting you to experiment. Environmental storytelling is everywhere, from abandoned ruins to scattered notes and remnants of past conflicts, which quietly build the world of Faerun without forcing exposition. Even encounters or areas that initially seem quite minor will often reveal deeper layers if you take the time to investigate. However, to me what really elevates this region though is its replayability. I've played through the game 4 times now, and even still, the wilderness of Act 1 rarely feels exhausting. Different class abilities, dialogue options, and moral choices consistently open up new paths and outcomes that you simply never saw before. And all of this makes you begin to realize just how much of this region you missed the first time round, and that sense of discovery remains intact far longer than in most other areas. Ultimately, Act 1's wilderness to me represents Baldur's Gate 3 at its most balanced. It effortlessly blends freedom with structure, narrative weight with exploration, and consequence with experimentation. It's not exactly the most climactic region in the game, but it's where the foundations of everything that follows after is laid, and it's where I believe the promise of Baldur's Gate 3 feels most fully realized. If you've watched any of my videos before, you'll probably be well aware of my critiques of Act 3. But one thing I can't deny is just the magic of the lower city region. After spending dozens of hours moving through wilderness, ruins, and controlled hubs, arriving in the lower city feels overwhelming in the best possible way. This is the first time the game places you inside of a space that feels genuinely alive at full scale. The streets are crowded, conversations overlap, and meaningful events are happening simultaneously in every single direction. For the first time in this game, it feels like the world doesn't wait for you. To me, what immediately stands out is the density of everything. The lower city isn't that large in the traditional open world sense, but it's packed to the brim both vertically and narratively. Almost every building can be entered, and many of them contain fully realized stories, from small self-contained tragedies to quest lines that directly intersect with the game's central conflicts. Locations like Sorcerer's Sundries and the Steelwatch Foundry aren't just some fun side attractions, but they're woven into the identity of the city itself. This is where all of your companions' arcs reach their conclusions, and where the long-running threads of the game's narrative finally demand some resolution. The city also reflects the consequences of your journey more clearly than almost any other region, even given its lack of reactivity that I've discussed at length in prior videos. Many characters will remember past decisions, factions will respond to your reputation, and the political tension surrounding Gortash and the Steel Watch clearly permeates everyday life. The presence of surveillance and authoritarian control contrasts sharply with the freedom that you experienced earlier in the game. Baldur's Gate doesn't feel like a place that you can fix so easily, but it feels like a system that's already been in motion long before you got here, and it's stubborn to change. Something that's both a positive and negative, I think, is how exploration here is deliberately messy. You're rarely guided cleanly from one quest to the next. Instead, quests often overlap and sometimes even compete for your attention. You might enter a building for one reason and then walk out having 3 new storylines to complete. That lack of structure is something that I definitely agree feels disorienting, especially at first, but it's great in reinforcing the idea that you're navigating a real city rather than a curated sequence of encounters. One big thing that I think makes the lower city especially incredible is how personal it becomes. It's the place where your companion's stories finally confront the wider world, and where your choices feel irreversible. You no longer feel like an outsider, but you're entangled in the city's power struggles, whether you want to be or not. To sum it up, the lower city ranks so highly for me because it's really the culmination of Baldur's Gate 3's core philosophy. It trusts you with your freedom, and accepts that not everything will be seen or resolved cleanly. It's overwhelming, imperfect, and for sure exhausting, but honestly I think it's still the most magical location in the entire game. I did warn you that this video would be my own opinion, and I think that fact is most obvious with my number 1 ranking. The Mountain Pass is the most focused location in Baldur's Gate 3, and while I wouldn't say this is at all why it ranks so highly for me, it's definitely one of its strong suits. From the moment you travel this route, the game narrows its lens completely. The sprawling freedom of Act 1's wilderness gives way to something much more deliberate and controlled. It's a region with a clear identity, and it never loses sight of what it's trying to explore. Visually, the Mountain Pass has to be the most beautiful location in the entire game. The open cliffs, the harsh sunlight, and the elevated terrain all immediately distinguish it from Act 1's wilderness area. But what of course truly defines the Mountain Pass is the Rosimorn Monastery and the Githyanki Creche housed within it. This isn't just some sort of dungeon or side path, but it's a cultural stronghold, and the game treats it as such. From the moment that I stepped inside, I was immediately immersed into the ideology of the Githyanki people, from their unquestioning obedience to their worldview that is built entirely around Vlaakith's authority. Another thing that makes this location so incredible is just how tightly it's tied to character and theme. For Lae'zel, the Mountain Pass isn't just some optional content, but it's foundational to her arc. The Creche forces her beliefs into direct conflict with reality, whether that's through the contradictions in the doctrine of the Githyanki themselves, or the audience with Vlaakith herself. The game doesn't tell you that something is wrong, but it lets you witness it unfold through the dialogue and the subsequent consequences. The design of the area itself reinforces this tension. The encounters are all structured, the interior is confined, and progression feels much more intentional than in Act 1's wilderness region. Even the rewards you do gather along your way out of the area, like the blood of Lathander, are embedded directly into the monastery's history and symbolism, perfectly tying progression to the region's larger context rather than something random. Nothing here feels incidental, and I feel like that is by design. Even the fact that it doesn't at all overstay its welcome is part of the appeal to me. It delivers a complete and comprehensive arc within a relatively compact space. By the time you leave, something has already fundamentally shifted, both in Lae'zel's own understanding of her people and in your perception of faith and authority in the world of Faerun. Unlike other regions in this game that sprawl outward, the Mountain Pass turns you inward. It's less about freedom and more about confrontation with belief and identity. But if I'm being entirely honest, the reasons I've been spewing are not completely the reason it ranks so highly for me. This is obviously subjective, but the first time I entered the Mountain Pass, hearing that music and seeing those beautiful vistas was when I realized this game was something special, which is exactly why it holds a special place for me. And that wraps up my personal rankings of the locations in Baldur's Gate 3. This was surprisingly difficult to put together, because really every location in this game clearly has a lot of care and intention behind it. Even the places that I ranked lower still serve an important purpose in the overall journey. As always, I'd love to hear how you'd rank these locations yourself, so don't hesitate to put your own list down below. Anyway, that's all from me for today's video. If you enjoyed, please consider subbing to the channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 and RPG content, and I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.